again, and welcome to War Stories, behind the scenes tales from the front lines of the media. I'm your host, Tom Curley. Welcome to yet another show. And for those of you that have not tuned into the show before, I'm not going to explain it. We tell war stories, okay? I was in the business at CBS for almost 40 years, and my crazy co-host, this Yahoo here, Garry Armstrong, was in the business for almost 35 plus years, and we get together every week and we tell about all the crazy crap that happened to us while we were doing our jobs. Garry, how the hell are you today?
Um, like you, I'm kind of under the weather. We have this stuff that's in the sky that's drifting down from somewhere. It's all yellowish and it's making us feel icky.
Yes. Yeah, icky. I've been watching it on the news. It's insane. It's the smoke from the wildfires in Canada.
That's amazing.
New York
That's
City.
amazing.
New York City is basically closed down. And I went outside
Wow.
today because I looked outside and I went, it looks funny. Like the light looked funny. And I went outside and I looked up and the sky wasn't gray, it was yellow. I mean, yellow. And you know
That's
what's
really
interesting?
creepy.
This is a perfect. It's really creepy, and this is, believe it or not, a perfect example of Al Gore's original book, An Inconvenient Truth, about how large major events can affect climate change
Right.
very very quickly. And I remember the example was uh, when Mount Pinatubo, I think it was in the Philippines, erupted in 17, I don't know, 80 or 85. Uh, it took a plume of the ash drifted across Europe and it hung there
Hmm.
for months and months and months, and it caused a famine. And if you look in history, there was the famous summer where it snowed in July and
Right.
other crazy stuff like that, and it caused a famine, and then that led, believe it or not, to the French Revolution. So climate change
Oh, yeah.
can
I mean,
do that. Now I don't know.
the climate change deniers really,
It's
they can't be this, well, they can be this dim. So let's move on from that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's crazy. So uh I, all right, here's the goal for this episode for people who watched last week's episode. Hopefully, at no point during this episode will we hear a clip of Some Enchanted Evening.
Some enchanted evening.
It's oh God, yes, I, I, it absolutely is. So let's get right to it. What do you have
Okay.
for us this week?
Okay, I mean, talking we were talking about weird and creepy things, which brings me to my remembrance of spending some time with Vincent Price. Goes back to sometime in the 70s, and Price was on a national tour for artwork. He was an artisan, collected a lot, kind of like Edward G. Robinson, so different from his screen persona. He was a Renaissance man, and he was in Boston to promote some art showing, and we got him to sit down and do an interview for us. So he sits down, and everyone in the newsroom is hovering around and saying, "Oh wow, that's Vincent Price, yada yada yada." And he smiles and says, "Are we ready to go?" And I said, "I've been waiting for this one." And he said, "I bet you are." And he said, it's terrific to be able to be promoting artwork. So many people think of me as doing these kinds of movies. And I said, "What kind of movies?" And he said, "You know." And I said, "I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. What's your favorite flick that I did?" And I said, "Well, there's a movie called The Baron of Arizona." And he just looked at me, he just stared at me. He said, "You saw that?" And I said, "Yeah, it was interesting." Baron of Arizona is late 40s, 47 or 48. It's a Western. And Vincent Price plays a bad guy, but not the usual Vincent Price bad guy. He's trying to snap up the local farmland and the local ranch lands and all that sort of thing. But what's interesting is that he carries it off in style as a Western villain. And he listened to me tell the story, and then he just chuckled and he said, "Oh man, I had so much fun with that. I got to wear a cowboy hat. I did a little riding, and I never fell off. And I wanted to do more Western, but I didn't get any more offers. I even wanted to do some TV Westerns." And he started humming themes from Western TV songs. And I said, "You have a good voice." And he said, "Well, I have an extensive classical music collection." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And he said, uh, "Do you like classical music?" And I said, "Well, I enjoy it, but it's not really the favorite music in my bag." And he said, "Well, what do you like?" And I said, "Well, it's kind of old." And I said, "What about you? Do you like popular music from days gone by?" And he said, "Well, as I said, I'm a classical music person. I like to think of myself as being very stately." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And he looked at me for a minute and he said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yes, I'm ready." And he started singing, "Oh, Genevieve, sweet Genevieve." And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, "When you wore a tulip and I wore a..." And he said, wait a minute. That's not the kind of music I would expect from you." And I said, "Well, what do you expect from me?" And then he said, "Well, I don't know whether it would be proper or not, but," he said, "way down upon the Swanee River."
Swanee, how I love you, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.
And I said, "That isn't really politically correct." And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, if you look at someone like me, in this day and age, it really wouldn't be proper." And he said, "Well, I didn't mean to insult you, Mr. Armstrong. Call me Gary. All right, you can call me Vinny. Fine, Vinny. Uh, I like singing for people at senior citizens' homes because I just feel relaxed with them." And he said, "Well, how can you? You're such a young man. How can you enjoy that sort of thing?" And I said, "Well, you know, God's gift from up above of his selfish love I found in my mother's eyes." And he looks at me and goes, "Swanee, Swanee, how I love you, how I love you, my dear old Swanee."
Swanee, how I love you, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.
And then he said, "Well, what about we do something like..." I said, "Don't do that song. I can see it in your eyes." And he says, "I'm going to do it." I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Old Man River." I said, "No, it's not river. It's river. River. Ribber." And he said, "Man, don't go there. Old Man River. That old man river."
Old Man River, that old man river.
I said, "You're Vincent Price. You can't be singing songs like that." And then he dialed back into Swanee, Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.
Swanee, how I love you, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.
I'm thinking, Vincent Price, I would have never guessed that you were the kind of man you are from the films you did. And he said, "A lot of people feel that way." And I said, "I was just thinking, Vinny." Yeah, Vinny. I said, "Vinny, I really loved you in Laura," which is a classic film noir, as you know. And he said, "Oh my goodness, that may be my favorite film. I had a crush on Gene Tierney." And he started telling stories about the filming of Laura, which was shot by Otto Preminger. And if you know anything about Otto Preminger movies, usually they're kind of weird or they're war movies or something like that. And for some reason, 20th Century Fox assigned Preminger to shoot Laura, and it was turned out to be a classic. So I'm sitting back waiting to hear stories about Gene Tierney or Dana Andrews, who's always been one of my favorite actors, film noir, and Laura might have been his best. But instead of talking about them or talking about the lovely music that came out of that film, he was saying, Clifton Webb was really strange. He used, the songs you're singing now, Gary? And I said, yes, Vinny. He said, Clifton Webb, when he wasn't on camera, he would walk around singing vaudeville songs. And I said, that's strange. And he said, no, 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 no. Clifton Webb used to be a vaudevillian before he started doing straight acting. And he always loved doing vaudeville. He does flip flops and he puts on clown masks. But he was always very eccentric. He sang songs about his mother. I think Clifton was a mother's boy. And I said, what do you mean about that? He said, well, sometimes look at how Clifton Webb moves around the screen. And I said, I thought, well, he always seems very prissy. And then Vincent Price stared at me and said, prissy might be an understatement when you're talking about Clifton Webb. And I said, Vinny, I think Clifton is around and maybe we should be careful of what we're saying about him. So he smiled and said, yeah, we should be nice. Now, Swanee, how I love you, how I love you, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. And I said, okay, let's kind of move on. And he said, well, when I really get down and I really want to do something special, I think about doing films with Edward G. Robinson. I really wanted to do what was the film? And I said, I don't know, Vinny. You haven't told me. He said, I wanted to do that film all about Eve. And I said, what happened? He said, well, I knew they were making it. And he said, I knew that Betty Davis had gotten the role because Claudette Colbert was supposed to do the lead role, but she became pregnant or something like that. And he said, but I, I went in and I auditioned, but they said they were looking for somebody who was a little bit more aloof. And I said, you mean like George Sanders? And he said, yeah, damn George Sanders. He's always landing the roles that I want. And I said, do you really think you could have carried that off? And he said, dear boy, I could have really been George Sanders and more. I can be that way. I can be very prickly, but I'm also a nice man, and George Sanders isn't. So I lost the role of a lifetime in All About Eve. And he said, I really think sometimes there's a reason why these things happen. So I said, how can you make that make sense if that was such a juicy role? And he said, well, I have all of these other things I do, and they make money. And because they make money, I can come and do things like this with you. And I said, okay, was that a compliment? And he smiled and looked at me and went into Swanee, Swanee, how I love you, how I love you. And I said, okay, okay, I get it, I get it. And he said, I've forgotten why we're here. Why are we here? And I said, you're the guest, I'm the host. I don't know. He said, art. How much money do you have, Gary? And I said, not that much. And he said, well, maybe we can work something out. Swanee, Swan. Okay, Vinny, let take it down a little bit. And he said, oh my, I think time is almost up. And I looked at my watch and I said, well, this has been fun. We could go on. And he said, let's make it a wrap. And he said, you see the people in the newsroom looking at us, Gary? And I said, yes, Vinny, I do. And he said, okay, let's give them something to remember. They've been waiting for this. And I said, okay, is this going to be good, Vinny? He says, Gary, you're going to love it. And I said, okay. And he said, tell your guy to start moving in closer. Vinny, he heard you. And he said, oh, they're cool, Gary. And I said, yes, they are. And he said, okay, they're coming in. Gary, what? I said, that's classic Vincent Price. Call me Vinny. That was a wrap on Vincent Price.
Oh yeah, the hard the hardest part I have with this one is trying to picture Vincent Price being called Vinny. I mean,
It was you don't do that unless you're told you can do that. And he was sitting there. He had the blazer and the silk shirt and the ascot, and he had a pipe in his hand. So the image was totally different from Vinny. But
that
he
is
was
funny. I mean,
such
you
a
you go
funny,
from
funny guy.
oh, that is funny. You go from hi, hello, I am Vincent Price, but off screen, hey, just call me Vinny. How you doing? Oh my God, that's funny. Well,
And
I
obviously obviously he thought I was going to ask him about horror movies, but that would have been stupid. because everyone
Well,
asks me about
I will.
horror movies.
What I am impressed, I've noticed there's a thread through all these stories where basically in every story, every person you've met, you manage to mention the most incredibly obscure movie
Right,
that they were
right.
in, which I can see that's why it would impress them. I think maybe we should start a show where I just type in obscure movies and see if you know them. We should have, well, maybe there a version of Stump the Band, Stump Garry, because the cool thing is when I'm doing post production, what I get a kick out of is
Oh
every time
yeah,
you mention
yeah,
an obscure movie, I'll go to Google and I'll type it, and sure enough, I can find a poster for it. Which
yeah,
you
yeah.
know
I noticed. I
the
noticed
internet
that in
is.
last week's show. Yeah, but
Oh yeah,
Tom,
no,
these
if you
these
think about it,
yeah, the people who came in to guest on the programs that you worked, they were used to getting questions, typical questions A, B, C, and D, and the reporters normally had the stuff that was given to them by their producers, and I sensed early on that they were so sick and tired of because they had done X number of shows across the country, and they were really bored with hearing the same questions. So in my mind, I thought, why don't I ask them about movies so and so that maybe didn't do well at the box office or the critics whacked the heck out of the movie, or something that I had heard from somewhere that they had enjoyed doing it. They put their own money into it, and that always clicked. That always worked. I mean, the Charlton Heston story about making the Western Will Penny, um, he was so enamored with that movie, and he was so happy to get away from Moses and all those larger than life characters to be able to talk about that movie. That would have taken all day. So that was the key. I found out early on. If you asked them about something that not many people talk about, you've got them.
yep, absolutely. Now I don't know why this popped into my head while you were talking about that because it has nothing to do with it. Oh, I know why. It is because yesterday, believe it or not, um, I was invited to give a speech in front of the Westport Rotary Club at their weekly luncheon. And I was asked to talk about my days at CBS. Basically, I was telling war stories. And
Hmm.
Ellen, my wife, gave me a list of everything that she wanted me to say, all the stories, many of which we have already told on this show.
Right.
And she listed about 4 or 5 of them. And she said, is that going to be enough? You've got to fill a half hour. I said, Ellen, I'm going to be lucky if I get, I'm going to be lucky if I
Right.
get to the second one. And sure enough, I barely made it past the second one. But one of the ones that was on the list that I had forgotten about, there was a time on the morning news, and there was the story that we were covering, which was sort of interesting. There was $1 million bounty out on a dog. He worked for the
Wow.
DEA. He was a Rottweiler, okay, 150-pound Rottweiler, who was
Right.
the bounty was on his head is because he was responsible for millions of dollars of drug busts, mostly
Uh,
cocaine. So the story was so while we were waiting the segment to come on, his handler, a DEA agent, and the dog, who was awfully sweet, I mean, but he was huge, was in the audio booth. So I sat down with the guy. I'm a dog lover, so hey, whoa, what a
right.
great, good doggy. And the guy, the DEA agent, he has a briefcase, and he opens up the briefcase, and in it is a pound of pot, couple of kilos of cocaine, a pound of heroin, some hash oil, and I look at it,
Wow.
and all I can say is, I go, wow, you don't see that every day, and 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 the guy laughs, and he says, yeah, what we're gonna do is we're gonna put a bunch of luggage out on the set, and then the dog is going to find the briefcase that has all the drugs in it. And so we struck up a conversation, and he was still laughing. He said, I had a funny experience on the way to the studio. The studios always provide car service. They don't pay for guests
Right.
to come on. That's called, you don't do that, but they will. If you have to fly in, they'll pay your airfare. They'll put you up in a hotel, and they'll give you a car service. So in the car
Right.
service, on the way over, he said the dog went nuts and started to completely rip up the seat in the back seat, just destroyed it. And who's gonna tell a 150-pound Rottweiler, stop doing that? Well, the driver
Right.
went crazy, and he's going, "You gotta pay for this. You gotta pay for this. You ruined my car." And the DEA agent goes, "He's only doing that because there's obviously so much cocaine in those seats that
Right.
he's finding it for me." And the guy goes, "No, you don't have to pay. You don't have to pay. It's okay. It's okay. You go. You go. You go." I,
Gotcha.
I gotcha. So, so, all right. So I do have one other story. This is my main one. Have you have you ever had a show which you were doing and trying to get it on the air, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, but somehow you managed to pull it off? I'm now going to tell you probably one of the worst days in my career. All right. We
Okay.
had built a studio for 60 Minutes. It was a special control room. It was different from all the other control rooms because it was self-contained. It had its own tape operators, its own tape room, its own color corrector. The control room itself, the audio booth was in the whole main control room, which was icky because audio guys, we want to be in a room that we can shut the door so
Right.
that way we can laugh at everything that's going on. So they discovered shortly after they built it, some executive got the bright idea that, we can rent this thing out, which of course is perfectly reasonable. So ESPN
Right.
was starting a show called Shap Talk with Dick Shap, who was a well-known sports reporter for ESPN. And it was going to be a talk show, okay? A phone-in show.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, we had to bring out a piece of equipment that hadn't been used in years, all right? And it was a piece of equipment, it was a computerized piece of equipment that was designed for talk radio stations. And it was called the People Link system. And it was this whole tall rack that was full of computer equipment and tape machines and cart machines. And it came with these, I don't know how to describe it, these large modules that would have 10 phone lines, 10 big buttons that you could press. And there was one for the guy on the air, one for the host, and then there was one for the producer who was in the control room. And then there was, I think, maybe one for the audio engineer. And it connected to a computer screen, so a producer could answer a line, say, "Hi, how are you? Who are you? I'm Garry Armstrong. What do you want to talk about?" "I want to talk about the Red Sox." And he'd say, "Okay," and he'd put you on hold. And this thing had the ability to play the show into your ear while you were on hold, or play music. It was very, very versatile. And
Mhm.
then on the screen, the Dick Shap on the air could have a computer screen that would say, "Up next, line 2, Garry Armstrong." And then he had his box, and he'd be like, "Okay, now we're going to go to line 2. Garry Armstrong wants to talk about the Red Sox. Hi, Garry, how you doing?" All right,
Right.
fine. Well, we hadn't used this thing in years. The last time we had used it was, I think, maybe 1980. It was shortly after Reagan came into office. We briefly did a show that was competing with Nightline. All right. And it was
Hmm.
called America's Talking. All right. And it was supposed to be a
Remember?
talk show. Yeah. Okay. America's Talking. Well, now there's a whole other story, tangent. Remind me, I'll get back to this, how the delay system didn't work. But anyway, that was the last time we used it. So it had been sitting in mothballs for a long time. I don't know how many years. And so I got the call to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and my job was to set up the people link system. And why was that? Well, it was because I was one of the few people that had ever used it. All right. So, Carly, set the thing up. All right. So at 8 o'clock in the morning, I haul this antique relic and I bring it into control room 33, and I'm trying to hook it up. And I put out the modules and I run all the wires and I turn the thing on, and there's only one small problem. It doesn't work. It won't turn on.
Oh,
No matter what I try, it
oy.
won't turn on. Now, I'm not panicking yet because if this thing doesn't work, there is no show. This is the first time
Right.
we've ever rented out our control room. This is the first time we've ever done business with ESPN. So all day I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I call the company. I get tech service. They don't know what's going on. Eventually, as hours go by, I'm talking to the president, the guy that created the damn thing. And for hours, we are just trying everything imaginable. It doesn't work. So now it's close to air. We're 10 minutes to air, and I'm in a complete panic, and I haven't told anybody about this. So finally, I go, look. Could there be a fuse? Could a fuse be blown? And he went, I don't know. Take a fuse out and look at it. So I take a fuse out and I look at it, and it's fine. It's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And I go, there's nothing wrong with it. He says, well, I don't know what to tell you. I give up. And I go, you can't give up. You're the guy that created this thing. He said, I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. So I put the fuse back in, and as I plug the fuse back in, the whole rack goes and all the lights come on. And I go, it's working. And he says, oh, well, now that I think about it, if it had been sitting for many, many years, the fuse could have become resistive, and that might have been just enough to, not make the thing work. So basically, I had to unplug the fuse and plug it back in. Yeah. So I could have killed him, but I didn't want to because I was so ecstatic. I did it. I fixed
Right.
it. It's
Right.
working. I have saved the day. I mean, I was on one of the ultimate highs of my life, and it was about to come crashing down around my head. So as I got up and walked over to the audio booth to tell them, the audio guys, that everything was working, I noticed that my boss and two maintenance guys are hovering around the audio board. And I go, what's the matter? And they turn to me and they go, the audio console is dead. It's not working.
Oh,
And I go, it can't be. I just fixed the people link system. So what was going on, it turns out, was, again, this is another Artie Shine story, the audio engineer who was famous for disasters, creating disasters.
yeah.
He was patching up the show as he was supposed to do, and the console went off. Well, he looked down, and the power supply, the power supply that turned the console on, the button was in the off position. All right, so he turned it on. All right, fine, big deal. Everything's solved. Done. Well, no, not for Artie. He's got to find out why. Why did this turn off? So he notices that the off position is down. The on position is up.
Yeah.
So he goes, could I
Right.
have dropped a patch cord? Could I have taken a patch cord and it just hit that button, and it's so sensitive that it would turn it off? And he drops the button, a patch cord, and sure enough, it turns off. So he turns it on. Okay, problem
Oh,
solved.
wow.
But no, he can't let it go. He's got to call over his boss. Sammy, come over here. You've got to see this. Sammy was a cool guy, very down to earth. And he goes, yeah, what? What's the problem? He goes, look, I dropped a patch cord on the button on the power switch, and it turned off. And look what's happened when I do this. And he does it, and it turns off. And Sammy goes, well, don't do that. What's wrong with you? And so he's going, no, he's going, well, but no, this shouldn't be like this. This is installed wrong. And as he's doing it, he's dropping a patch cord, turning it on, and he does it about 2 more times, and it turns off, and he turns it back on, and the console doesn't come back on. He turns this up and on. It doesn't come back on. It's dead. The console's dead. So now by the time I entered the picture, audio maintenance guys were up there, and they were all stumped. We were trying to find maybe there was a fuse. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, now we're about 5 minutes to air, okay? And ESPN is on the phone, and the TD goes, ESPN's on they want bars and tone. And Artie blurts out, we can't, the audio console's dead. The TD goes, what? You can hear the guy on ESPN going, what? What? Is there a problem? Is there a problem? And so at this point, I tell everybody, because Artie, he's a puddle. He's a complete nervous wreck. I go, all right, guys, this is a computer. This was the time when computers were new. This console was very, very digital, okay? And it was one of the first that were like that. So I said, guys, it's a computer. Sometimes the only way to fix it is you turn it off. You wait 30 seconds for all the capacitors, all the juice to go out of the microchips, and you turn it back on. So I turned it off, and I counted to 30. It was the longest 30 seconds of my life. And I turned it back on, and everything came back. Okay, problem solved, except this was a digital console. You didn't patch it up with patch cords. Part of that, but mostly you did it all, you assigned it. You assigned this to this. It was all done digitally, so you had to physically push a bunch of buttons to program it. Well, at this point, Art, he was he had completely lost it. So we're about 2 minutes to air, and I am over his shoulder frantically patching everything up. And we got to air, we went on the air, and the whole show went off without a hitch. You would have never known that any of this happened. And I walked out of there going, that's it. This is the worst day and the best day of my life. So we had other stuff to get to, but we're not going to, because we have not only run out of time, we've run overtime. We did it again. Ooh. Gary's got some other cool stories we'll get to next week. Time for the plugs. Well, let's get through them quickly this time. Serendipity, Seeking Intelligent Life on Earth, the blog that your wife created, we all contribute to. It's a lot of fun. We post every episode of Media War Stories up there, so check that out. My audio theater group, Voicecapes Audio Theater, for the best in audio theater and comedy and drama. And half-hour radio show, the cult hit from the 80s, is still here. And, of course, my co-sister podcast, Get Off My Lawn, with Tom Curley, where we talk about life, the universe, and everything. We don't know what the answer is, except I think it's 42. Anyway, it was fun. See you next week.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.